A lot of my friends want to ask me how my time in the Air Force was, but they never do. I think they assume that I was traumatized by what I saw during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm perfectly fine with them continuing to assume that. When things get dark, they leave me alone. I know that's not healthy, but that's exactly what I want for now. But I feel like I should leave some sort of record somewhere out there. The truth is, during my entire time stationed overseas, I did my job behind a computer, sitting at a desk in an air-conditioned bunker. During my official military career, I knew 14 people who died. 1 to cancer, 2 were blown up by IEDs, and the rest were killed in car accidents. That's the reality of military service. Overall, you're far more likely to die of a normal cause, even if in higher than normal rates. So, my official military career isn't why I can't sleep at night, or why I sometimes find myself crying for no apparent reason, or even my 1,000-yard stare that has become my resting face. The real truth has to do with me being assigned to Flight 616 in basic military training. During these 6.5 weeks of training, we had at least 34 out of 50 trainees washed back to their units or kicked out of the military. At least because that's just how many I personally witnessed. I should have known something was up when the buses arrived at Lackland Air Force Base. Everyone else in my bus was part of 2 flights, a male and female one that were paired together. Flight 616 was composed of 1 or 2 trainees from each bus instead, and we found ourselves isolated in a dilapidated building that oversaw the main parade ground. Our training instructor was one of those jerks who saw the first parts of Full Metal Jacket 100 times, and still has a bruised ego from whatever hazing he went through during basic. Training under him was brutal, far worse than I had expected. He woke us up an hour earlier than any other flight and we drilled 2 hours later. Slaps and kicks were common. At first, when people went missing, I thought they were getting moved to other flights. It was always the problem trainees whose beds would be empty when we woke up. When somebody messed up our marching routine too bad, they would meet with a TI behind our dorm, and we would never see them again. Our former dorm chief tried telling other flights TIs that something was wrong and he ended up disappearing that night. And on top of that, we had a few guys to try to commit suicide. One of them blinded himself with cleaning chemicals when he was cleaning the restroom, but he was stopped from drinking too much of the stuff. They told us that he was moved to a medical flight and would be discharged after being diagnosed with whatever mental illness he obviously had. Another guy cut his wrist. The TI sat us down in the day room and talked to us about it that same day. But instead of reassuring to us that suicide wasn't the answer, he made jokes about how it was obviously a ploy for attention since the trainee lived. He said that if we were going to attempt something, then the least we could do was see it through. And so we spent the rest of the hour practicing by pretending to cut our wrists over and over again. I know it sounds bizarre, but when you're broken down, surrounded by 50 other guys who are going through it, you just go along with it too. Anyways, I could go on for ages talking about other incidents and odd occurrences. But there is one incident that I have to put out there, that I have to preserve before anything happens to me. It was actually during the best week, at the time we had there. Even better, our TI was nowhere to be seen. We got new instructors, the cadres, for that week dedicated to firing ranges, obstacle courses, gas masks, and all that other fun stuff. At least I did have fun until Hell's Mile. Hell's Mile started deep in the woods with a simulated attack on a simulated base, while we defended as best as we could with our simulated rifles. The base had a pre-dug defense and plenty of empty buildings to fight over. The cadres would walk or run from the cover of the woods as far as they could into the base, before being challenged by a trainee. We had very specific responses to whatever they did, and messing up meant you died and moved back to the center of the base. I immediately ran for a foxhole with 3 other trainees and aimed my bright blue M16 ahead of us towards the trees. A cadre appeared from behind them and slowly walked towards us with a hand behind his back. I yelled at him to stop, but he kept moving. He slowly pulled his hand from behind his back to reveal a handgun. The cadre pointed it at me, so I yelled, "Simulating deadly fire," which should have had the cadre turn around and walk back into the woods before trying again. But instead, my rifle roared to life and a bright flash of light issued from the muzzle. The cadre fell to his knees and slumped forward as blood poured from his nose. I was frozen in fear. Another cadre ran over to me. I expected to be arrested or at least drop-kicked away from the murder weapon that I still held onto. But he just yelled at me to get back to the center of the base, to let the next trainee move up and take their turn in the foxhole. Somehow he had missed seeing the freshly killed cadre, who had fallen into the long grass. No one else seemed to react either, so I realized that I was hallucinating. I had been working exceptionally hard this week with almost no sleep. I should have been more surprised that something like this hadn't happened sooner. Either way, I had no other options but to keep playing along. We often would end up having to arrest cadres too, while they kept on coming under the cover of pre-recorded whistling bullets and explosions played over loudspeakers that covered the plywood base. For the rest of the exercise, I just arrested cadres or warned them away. I never tried firing the rifle again, which led me to getting into a bit of trouble every now and again, but I didn't want to risk letting my imagination run wild again. Eventually, retreat was signaled and we pulled out to the next part of the obstacle course. While we were heading out, one guy from my flight was approached by a cadre. He meekly told me the sign and the cadre just repeated what had been said. My guy compulsively gave the countersign and was immediately pulled out of the formation. I didn't see him join me at the end of the line, with all the others who had been killed or gotten others killed. He just followed a cadre into the woods and that was that. One brief march later, and we were at the next obstacle, a long, winding pit filled with sand and barbed wire stringed overhead. One path ran through grass parallel to the pit and the cadres paced these constantly. As we lined up to crawl underneath, the cadres paired us up as battle buddies. Besides the name, I was fine with this idea. I trusted every single boy in my flight. At 22, I was one of the oldest, with my life at this point. But when it came my turn, I was paired with the last trainee from the flight ahead. Another of his flight turned towards me and shook his head solemnly. His eyes teared up and the sight of him made me considerably less fine with this battle buddy I knew nothing about. But there wasn't time to get acquainted. We were held up for a second at the front of the line until there was enough space to continue. At the cadre's signal, I threw myself to the ground and began crawling quickly but carefully. My body became one with the ground, my rifle cradled in my arms to keep it safe from the sand. I didn't want to find out what happened to those who disappeared into the woods. However, with only silence next to me, I became aware my buddy wasn't crawling next to me. Thus, when I heard the cadre yelling to get out of line, I knew he was speaking of me. I rolled sideways under the barbed wire and off the sand, into grass still wet with condensation. I stood up and I saw my buddy, looking gloom, standing next to the cadre who explained to him, "You dropped too slow and you got wounded. When that happens in real life, your friends have to carry your dead weight to the back lines." Luckily, I didn't have to actually carry Buddy, but we did have to go to the back of the line, though in good company. I took consolation in the fact that everybody was sent back at some point. Many of them at the end were told that they simply didn't do it fast enough. I figured this was all on purpose. No matter how well anybody did, we'd all get sent back at least a couple of times. The next time, we actually got halfway through, but Buddy must have badly needed to know exactly how far we had left to go. He raised his head high to confirm our position to him, and his idiocy to me. I hissed at him to get his head down. Luckily, none of the cadres were looking our way. We had a shot of waiting out this error if only Buddy could get his head down and fast. But instead, Buddy kept looking around. I thought he had gone off the deep end and was begging to be caught. I pleaded with him not to take me down with him, but he stubbornly refused to talk. He just kept shaking his head slightly. Other trainees were starting to pile up behind us, adding to the desire to club Buddy unconscious and just drag his body the rest of the way. I knew leaving him would just result in me getting into trouble, so I rolled on my side to look closer. Buddy had gotten his helmet stuck in the barbed wire. He was pulling and shaking, but only with his head. His hands were still glued to his rifle. I lent a hand to unhook a barb that had gotten caught on his mesh that surrounded his helmet. Once free, he dropped his head, and I breathed a sigh of relief. And then the clapping started. At some point, every single cadre had become aware of our predicament, and had just been watching the entertainment. One of the cadres, still clapping, knelt down and gave me a wide smile before abruptly shouting, "Get to the back of the line!" The next time through, Buddy dug the barrel of his rifle into the ground, and we went back to the end of the line. And then Buddy lost an MRE out of his thigh pocket and left it behind, and we went back to the end of the line. And then we actually made it all the way out. When Buddy stood up, he swept his rifle over my body, and we went back to the end of the line. And then we made it out again, but Buddy ran ahead while I stopped to ask a cadre for permission to adjust. The cadre started to answer me. "There's no time to adjust in war. Hey, don't leave your battle buddy." And we went back to the end of the line. We went back again and again. Every time there were less and less trainees around us. I had thought Buddy was bad as a nervous klutz, but then I saw him as an exhausted klutz. The level of incompetency rose as he continued to make the same errors over again. He swept his gun over a cadre. He raised his head 2 more times. He stood up too early. He dropped too late. I wondered why no one took him out and into the woods. Every other flight seemed to get multiple chances to make mistakes without getting worse than yelling. But at some point, Buddy must have found the time to make a deal with the devil, because we eventually made it through without a mistake. At this point, we had been the only 2 crawling for a while. We had long ceased to be crawling through sand. Instead, we had pushed away enough that we were just on the concrete that had been hidden underneath. I was bleeding from my elbows and knees. Most of the cadres had moved on, but at least one was still watching. I learned my lesson and moved with Buddy quickly to the next section. I only slowed down when we were out of the cadre's sight. I asked Buddy to slow down too, but he ran ahead, ignoring the activities that littered this part of the woods. And so he abandoned me. I could see enemy mannequins hanging out behind several of the trees. The first few looked like your usual clothing store mannequins, dressed in camo uniforms, but they quickly became more haphazardly put together and dirty as I went through the woods. Either way, they weren't going to kill themselves, so I started to jog forward, balancing my rifle with one hand while the other held my pants up. And so I guess I should explain that we were in a rush when we first issued our uniforms and initial equipment. There were a lot of tubs that were pushed by. One would have size 8 boots, the next then size 9. A few tubs down had socks. We had reached in and grabbed what we thought we needed. There was no trying on to make sure you had the right size. You just had to grab and pray. I was lucky that most of my gear was an okay fit. The only thing I really screwed up was on my belt. I got a size that was way too big. I tightened it as much as I could, but I had to make my own holes to make it work. This got me through the day, thankfully, because we had to wait until the TI got around to fix the biggest error. He made a list of who needed what and sent some boys to pick them up. But then he started to fix what he thought he could take care of himself. Instead of getting me a new belt, he grabbed a pair of scissors and haphazardly stabbed and cut at them while I held on to both ends and pushed the belt as far away from my vital points as I could. I had indicated when I thought the ideal place for him to cut was, but I was dismayed to see him cut 2 inches off center. I traded a belt that was too long for one that was too short. It was still serviceable. I could wrap it around me, but the end was fraying immediately. I had to make some more new holes and it seemed to work out. Honestly, I was just happy to get by without being stabbed. By the time Warrior Week in Hell's Mile came about, I had lost another couple of inches on the belt due to wear and it was getting really tight. Crawling over the sand that many times and over the concrete had destroyed what was left of my belt around the buckle. It wasn't too bad when I was crawling. I was laying down and moving carefully, even though quickly so no one looking down could tell. But as soon as I stood, I could feel my pants sagging, the belt no help at all. I became skilled at rising to my feet, while bringing my rifle into a resting position, and catching the front of my pants with the hand that also held the rifle's grip. When I went through the woods, I was exhausted and more worried about my pants falling down than anything else. I had completely forgotten about my hallucination earlier, and the simulated fire against the mannequins. I was shot all over again when my training rifle fired and tore a hole into the mannequin propped up in a tree. Blood spurted out. I told myself that it had to be another trick, that the cadres were just trying to get us toughened up for war, and so I moved on without getting too close. Soon after that though, I heard something crashing through the woods ahead. I reflexively fell to the ground and rolled to the edge of the woods. 3 cadres walked out from behind trees and looked back my way. I wasn't sure at the time, but none of them saw me. They discussed where I and my buddy might have gone. One of them asked which one they wanted to take. Another replied that obviously they want the smart one, so the one who would be further ahead and first to show. And then they had a laugh about the horror show that had been the barbed wire crawl. I realized they were getting Buddy and I confused. Pretty much everybody looks the same as BDUs and BCGs and shaved heads. And then they waited. I had no idea why at the time, but the path forward loops around to the clearing they were in. I just tried to quietly slide further into the woods to avoid being spotted. I was actually doing a pretty good job until my hand touched a boot. It was a mannequin that had fallen from a tree above. Its mask had fallen off to reveal my old dorm chief. His face was gray-green, and he clearly had been dead for a while. I finally realized that no one from my flight was washed back to other units or kicked out of the military. I had pretty much resigned myself to death then. But that's also when Buddy came out of the woods and stumbled towards the 3 cadres. I watched in horror from behind the tree as one of the cadres produced and swung a club. He squarely hit Buddy in the head. The other 2 men grabbed his arms and quickly dragged him away, with the third following. After waiting in silence for 5 minutes, I was finally convinced that I was alone. Well, alone if you don't count the 30+ corpse mannequins in the woods with me. Either way, I ran past all the other obstacles set up and flew through the rest of the course. I had no idea how long it had taken me overall, but when I finally exited the woods, I saw every flight formed up and waiting to move out. A cadre, surprisingly polite, told me to get some water and pointed to a table that had been set up at the edge of the woods. A master sergeant was standing near with a clipboard, and I was informed to report into him after I had gotten a drink. I started to ask the cadre for permission to adjust, but was told to ask the master sergeant. And so I walked up to him, assumed the position of attention, and asked for permission to adjust. This whole time, I had been constantly moving and hadn't really gone to examine what was wrong with my belt. I still thought something might be done to help the situation. I also thought my parents would stay up like they had done the dozens of times in the woods when I had briefly let go of them. Instead, the second my right hand left my pants and curled up to a ball at my side is when my pants gave up and collapsed. Approximately 500 trainees and who knows how many cadres saw me in my tighty whities, standing at attention like an idiot. The master sergeant's voice dripped with disgust as he said, "Good God, son, adjust." I grabbed my pants and started to head to my own flight at the end of the line. I was shocked to see how few of us remained, but another dorm chief held up his hand and yelled at me to pay attention. It was Buddy's flight. Maybe they had been primed to expect him, or I really looked a lot more like him than I realized. Either way, I jumped at the chance to get into another flight. All I had to endure here was near constant snickering. It wasn't easy to pretend I was someone who I never even knew the name of, but I knew I was a dead man if I didn't try. Luckily, I was taking the place of someone everybody already expected to be a screw-up. We began another forced march to the next activity. I continued to hold onto my rifle grip and pants with one hand as we completed another mile and made our way to a large, if makeshift, forward operating base in the middle of some more woods. I never did get any water. Here, my flight shined. We had to split into two groups with one half keeping guard in the prone position, while the rest gathered and deployed sandbags. My new squad leader saw the state of my belts and made sure I was a guard so I didn't have to move around as much. The rest of the activity was fending off attacks from cadres from all directions. I was still uneasy with using my rifle, so I pretended to fall and break off the barrel. I would have to do hundreds of push-ups for this later, but it was worth the peace of mind of getting a new rifle. Every time we had an interaction with the enemy, we had to be tagged out and go report the interaction to intel in the middle of the base. When I had interactions, the guy behind me would tag me on the shoulder like we had practice, but then just asked me for the details and left to report themselves. In this way, I survived the day. I slowly ripped off my name tag and tore several other pockets. We had one last forced mile march and I nearly collapsed when we made it back to our tent, but I made it back alive. A cadre came by with a spare belt and didn't question me needing to get a new name tag too. I guess legitimately needing the belts made the rest easier to swallow. Either no one ever realized the switch or they just didn't care, but I was able to keep up the charade until getting assigned to my new base. And that's when I finally started using my own name again. I threw away the papers that I had been given and told the new base's records department that Lackland must have lost mine. The nice receptionist there told me not to worry and that they would recreate my files from then on. She winked and said that this happened all the time. I kept my mouth shut about this throughout my military career, but I still made sure to ask everybody what flight they were in during basic. To this day, I've never met anybody who had ever heard of Flight 616, much less graduated from it. Have you?